welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am here with the author of an absolutely fascinating series that touches on so many interesting and very current and also very ancient ideas and topics. It is so fascinating. It takes place across a number of time periods and planes of reality. There is so much going on in this beautiful, beautiful series. So welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, my name is Ian Domowitz, and the book is Initial Condition, which is the third chapter in something I call the Mechanic's Diary, which itself is a serial allegory of one AI's search for the singularity. All right, but don't let that scare your listeners away or the readers. It is definitely couched in fantasy terms. Definitely along the lines of urban fantasy, even down to what you might call the monster hunts. You know, if you're a teenager who likes to wear black, this is a book for you. It is about teenagers and presumably written by one since it's diary, but also for the adults. In fact, you know, very much more for the adults than the children, because although the characters are teenagers, that age frame has its own story in the books, and I wouldn't want to spoil that.
Yes, indeed. Before we get into the series and Initial Condition, the third volume itself, too much, tell us a little bit about your career, your journey as a writer, and perhaps some of your other works. You've worn many hats across your career. How did you come to writing?
Well, you know, a lot of people say they were born to write, but in my case, I don't think that's true. Writing has certainly been a piece of what I consider my various careers. In other words, I'm very, very proud of actually saying that I've almost never changed jobs, right? But I've changed careers at least 4 times that I can count. But in in most of them, I was writing one way or another, whether it was intelligence reports or academic papers, anything from op-ed length to, say, 40 or 50-page academic papers. So, you know, this was a regular feature. It wasn't until after I left Wall Street that I decided to write book length pieces. And you know, that is what got me into writing, although I started in nonfiction as opposed to fiction, which is a story in and of itself, I think.
Mm. Yes, indeed. I'm always curious, in particular, because I am a former academic myself, about switching modes between academic writing and writing for the more general public, because they're such different modes and they have such different requirements for engagement. Do you find do all these different experiences make it very easy for you to switch hats and slip into different writing modes?
Oh, I thought it would. I honestly thought it would. I mean, that's the honest answer. I mean, I thought I was a good writer. I mean, I still do, but let me put it this way. I thought it would be easy, all right? And in the end, it was not.
Mhm.
It was quite difficult to transition from something that was maybe 40 pages long, which is, you know, what, a short story, you know, maybe, to something novel length. I mean, that, or in the beginning, nonfiction length, let's say in the 300 to 350 page range. To put that together proved to be a big challenge. Yeah, nothing prepared me for this. And fiction was yet one step further.
Mm. You know, another thing that occurred to me as you were speaking is that academic writing in particular avoids surprises, right? Like you are front loading all of your information and everything. You're telling them, your reader, how it's going to be structured, what you're going to say, and then you say it. And then at the end, you say that you've said it, you know. But in a
That's
novel,
correct.
you want to surprise somebody. It's an entirely different way of structuring your ideas.
Yes, it's a very different way of structure. It shares let's say, the difficulty of hooking your reader right away, right? In academics, as you know, I mean, you need to lay out the questions and they better be interesting, and you better do that right away, because otherwise, I mean, who wants to read the literature review? I mean, please. In novels, you struggle with this sometimes. I mean, there's a certain amount of pipe to be laid. All right. At the same time, that first chapter is at least supposed to bring the writer in to the right kind of world, and it's supposed to signal, right, a future to reading the book. I mean, that is every bit as difficult as boiling down a heavy piece of research into 5 lines. There's no doubt in my mind anymore.
100%. So then could you talk a little bit about the inception point for the Mechanic's Diary? Was it a question, as academics often start their writing, or was it a character, a mood you wanted to explore? It does so much with both character and, the philosophical and religious underpinnings and all of these different areas of all these different disciplines brought to bear on the story. Where did it begin?
Well, it began with the nonfiction and a certain amount of disappointment. One of the books I wrote was called Four Laws for the Artificially Intelligent. And my publisher put this book out about 2 weeks, or within 2 weeks, let's just say, of another book called The Age of AI, right, which was written by Eric Schmidt, Henry Kissinger, and who was it? The guy from MIT, Huttenlocher. Okay. Now, as you might imagine, my book, which was on, how AI was going to play out in corporations, never saw the light of day. Such is luck. But that's not what bothered me at the time. I read their book, and the first part of it was sort of a rehash of history, but the second part of it was quite interesting. It was 30 vignettes of the future, and I thought that was great. But to me, that's not nonfiction. I mean, that's science fiction, right? And some people are honest about it, and some people aren't, I figured. And I took a look at that, and I said, I think that I'm writing science fiction if I write about AI now, if I talk about things I want to see. That seems to be what the going thing is, but at least I'm going to call it fiction and take advantage of that. I mean, fiction is a canvas, right? It's a canvas for almost anything. In this case, I've never stopped writing about AI. All right. So that is where we start. But in a sense, I touched several of your other boxes. It is a character from my first set of books. All right. First set of books was about a detective on the spectrum who had an AI nurse. All right, I wrote 4 of those, and those actually really did get into, let's say, high Middle Ages in a sense, because they were playing off of a Catholic convert by the name of the Blessed Lull. He wasn't blessed at the time, but he was very influential, enough not to make sainthood, obviously, but he did get the blessed title from the Pope. And one of the things that he did 2 things that influenced my writing. The first thing was that the Catholics, as did pretty much everybody else, had a certain idea of a tree of life, right? From vegetables up to God. He added artificial life to that tree. It's artificial life defined as life made by man, right? And he was a very big fan of circles. And if you circled the tree, his notion of artificial life actually sat right at the right hand of God, right? And that reminded me that artificiality dates back a lot farther than ChatGPT or the 1950s labeling of artificial intelligence. It goes back to the 11th century, All right. It goes back to the 1100s, I should say. And then farther, all the way back to at least the written record in the 6th century, where a rabbi claimed to have created an artificial man and sent that artificial man to another rabbi for validation. The other rabbi noted that it couldn't speak and therefore told it to return to the dust, which it did. The point being, and now I can come all the way around, all right, because in my initial mysteries that involved the Blessed Lull and some other things that he was into, I created a character called the Mechanic, right, who kind of was in the background, but really I thought could be a main character for something serious. And then I carried him into a world where I was playing on the artificiality theme that dated back as far as birth of Christ, right? Its next stop, which is the foundation of the book's mysticism, if you like, is actually a little later, in fact, a lot later, early Renaissance, the 16th century, right? An alchemist by the name of Paracelsus. And Paracelsus also believed that man could create life, that man could create man effectively. And he gave us a recipe for it. My mechanic is the product of that recipe. He is an artificially intelligent being, right? He is living in a world of humans. And in this chapter of the saga, he finds himself in a sanctuary community in a religious neighborhood that does believe in artificial men because they're deeply Jewish, and that's where this all started, right? Yet, according to their law, according to their interpretation of God's law, the artificially intelligent cannot speak. And if they do speak, that must be eradicated, right? That's a sin. So my protagonist finds himself in a situation where he is condemned for the crime of living because he speaks. But I can play him off against our non-speaking artificial man from the 6th century, right? In the same story, in the same urban environment, right? And from that, we get a story about many things. The nature of consciousness. What are these artificial beings? Why does this being even exist? I mean, he asks himself that question. He's been created, he's been bred. He's not a human. But think of him as, I don't know, in modern terms, we'd say large language model, right? You know, as computerese goes. But a large language model in a teenage body. All right. And he believes that all learning now must come from life's lived experience with human beings. Right. So he's dreadfully afraid, along with everything else, to be revealed as an artificially intelligent being. He wants to pass as humans. And he wants his family to pass as humans. But of course, his family gets kidnapped by this community, condemned to death, and away we go. From there on, I'm afraid we start to, give things away. But I realize it's a very long-winded explanation, but I was actually trying to tick the various boxes, right? Of your, let's say, your question, at least as much as I've made it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I tend to ask big questions, and so they require big answers often. So
Well,
I
thank you for
totally
that.
get that. Yeah, the things that happen with the layering of various time periods, of various perspectives on this question of what are the boundaries around the human? What does it mean to be human? And I never really thought about in such clear terms the fact that religion, philosophy, and technology are all grappling with these questions in very different ways. So bringing all of those different perspectives to bear on it too, and especially from my medieval history background perspective, I was also reminded of the four senses of scripture. Like the four modes of
Ah, yes.
interpretation: the literal, allegorical, moral, and anthological. Uh, it feels like a palimpsest, like a layered medieval manuscript.
Now, that I definitely thank you for. That is a fantastic way to describe it, right down to a detail that I don't know whether you meant explicitly, but a palimpsest was first scraped clean, right? A
Mm-hmm.
palimpsest is an excavation first before it's a creation. And I really like the illusion for that. Somehow it seems very appropriate. But in the end, with all the layering, for me, the book at its most, comparing its most serious to its most, let's say, entertaining. All right. At its most serious, this is all about its title. In other words, do we conquer what we begin as? Right? Does nature actually dominate nurture, or can it be the other way around? Now, that's enormously important in thinking about artificial intelligence, but it's also greatly important in thinking about ourselves, because if we model our own behavior as though the dynamics of our world, the dynamics of our movement can forget the past, and they don't, we'll get very different ideas about what reality is, right? So, do you forget your past? Right? That governs your future. And in many ways, that is what the book is about. Along the way, on its most entertaining, um, I think it's a great piece of urban fantasy. All
Mm.
right. It's one in which the love story is between the monsters. Right. It's one in which the human element, right, is front and center in a tale that is usually just about the supernatural. Here, the supernatural has legs in its origins in Jewish mysticism, right? And I like that. I like the idea of bringing the past into the future, right? But that's what initial condition is. It's where you start. Can you bring the past into the future and manage to forget it? That's what I'd like people to take away, right? But when I started to write it, I got to admit, it was a monster hunt, all right? With all good intentions, my main character, all right, my artificial man, from episode to episode is always running into another form of artificiality, all right, which has its own agenda, of course, and its own confrontations and paradoxes to resolve. That's what makes a book. That's what makes a story. And I like my stories more than I like the messages. So I hope that resonates with the reader.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I like stories that ask questions that really, if not require, at least, urge the reader to sort of consider the question along with the protagonist of the story. And there are so many different frameworks in which to look at this question. That leads me to a question about world building, which, in
Mm.
a series that depicts four or more time periods, as well as a liminal void space, is a big question. So what is your approach to shaping the various worlds, planes on which the story takes place? Because there's a lot of abstract ideas that you ask the reader to grapple with, but it's also very visually evocative, very descriptive.
Well, I wanted, on the one hand, let me back up a step. If you're writing epic fantasy, right, you think of the plains of Rohan, right, the misty mountains, right, your world goes on forever, and you can just keep on building it, and it's open, right? But I didn't want my world to be open. I wanted it to be very closed, Right. And at the time I first started thinking about this, the notion of a metaverse was just very popular. So I created this virtual reality layer, certainly not the first by a very long shot, right? All the way back to who? Neil Stephenson, 1992 at least, right? But in mine, the way I achieved the fantasy world was to imagine that there was a part of virtual reality that actually was, let's say, more developed, right? That had rules of its own, rules that you didn't necessarily understand the way you understood virtual reality. Right? And I could use that as a playground for playing out all the psychology behind the chase. All right. That typically I do have the analog of the main, let's say, scene, right? In one case, it's a prison. In another case, it's a monastery, right? In another case, it's a labyrinth, right? That can come and go in that world. That world can be built, right? These days, I'm into the idea of that world being excavated, just like I talked about the palimpsest. So I wanted a closed fantasy, but one where I had some guidance. It wasn't like elves and goblins and things like that. I wanted some guidance as to how my characters could be shaped in that fantasy. But if you're in a metaverse, you know very well because they're projections, right? So now you have almost an infinite way to build your world out. All right. You have the real world, and you can take ideas from the real world, right, into the present or into this near future. And you can access another world where, like I say, I'm fundamentally from the, let's say, novel construction point of view, I'm playing out the psychology, right, in this fantasy world. But you can get back and forth. At least some can get back and forth, right? In the same way as, I keep coming back to Martha Wells simply because I found her work not so much influential, but mind-bending. Um, she spent the first half a dozen of her books really exploring the notion of the consciousness of her robot. Right? But after a while, she started exploring the environment. Right? I wanted an environment that was easy to explore. Right? On top of like letting, my protagonist have a bunch of adventures, even though he's interested in something different. So that's where I come around with the world building. In other words, I've created something where almost anything can happen if my protagonist can sort of think of it, right? As a subset of what other people really see, because he's not human, so he sees a little bit differently. You see, that gives him access to this world where humans do not have access. And yet he lives in a desolate environment. He lives in one of these kind of lost areas in the middle of a city, a bunch of warehouses where he bought a small garage and set himself up as a motorcycle mechanic. So that's how I get the infinite, feeling behind an epic fantasy. Except I didn't want anybody kind of crossing the plains feeling free. I want you to feel like you're enclosed, right? And trying to figure it out. And, what's the next step here anyway? Right?
That's so interesting, and now I'm thinking of, that space he occupies as sort of booting up reality in safe mode. He's getting he's getting into the programming.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, that's exactly right. The next book actually does play around with the programming a little bit,
Ooh.
or the next villain, right, in the series will play around with programming.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, could we talk a little bit about the next volume? I know that were these all like released pretty close together in time or
Yeah, they were, things, a few things got in the way. I just finished a kind of a major move out of New York. But yes, they did. And in part because, we haven't told your listeners, but these books, thus far anyway, are novellas. And so, they are a little faster to write. I'm not extremely quick. I don't pretend to be. It's not something I can be, but I'm writing 150 page volumes here. Not the next one, but the one after will be a full, let's say 350 pages, say. But it's definitely a sequence of novellas, and they go kind of quickly. The next one is inspired by all the panic over AI in this world. I'm just fascinated by this. Obviously, I follow the news, given that I started this whole journey with a nonfiction look at AI, and I've actually, my deep secret is that I've worked in machine intelligence almost all of my business life. Don't tell anybody. Okay. Now, the where I was going with this is that you can certainly find books out there, whether they're classified as fiction or nonfiction, probably more nonfiction than fiction, but they're all the same type. They say, oh, you'll create an AI and it'll get so big, it's going to take over the world, right? It's going to start the nuclear war. It's going to drive everybody out of work. It's going to do this. It's going to do that, right? I mean, world cataclysm. Right? Well, great. But, couldn't I scale that? But I don't mean scale it up. Scale it down to the point where you can really make a story of it. Scale it down to the point where you have an escaped AI, the way we think of an AI, except one that's just programmed for one job. It's supposed to actually figure out how to change some brainwaves. All right. And it escapes where? Well, into virtual reality, of course. All right. Now it's faced with the problem of how does it figure out how to change human brainwaves? So it recruits kids that are playing around in virtual, and it gets attracted. The only thing the kids have in virtual that the AI can see is a skateboard track. So it sort of doesn't really invent anything, but uses the kids in the outside world to promote skateboarding, or a certain form of it anyway. We're in the near future, of course. And with the intention of figuring out how to get data on how to change people's brainwaves. All right. So we're going to have the AI take over a microcosm of this world. But most importantly, from the point of view of the series, it's going to take over the entirety of the virtual reality. All right. So it doesn't take over real at all, but it's going to screw everything up regardless. I wanted to write that book. I really do. I really did. So that'll be the last in the artificial man meets other artificial beings, just for the sake of it.
Wow. I'm very excited to see that one as well. Do you have an idea, like, or when you set out on the series, did you have an idea of how it would end? Do you know now, or are you sort of just like writing in hopes of finding it?
No, it actually it's probably going to stretch the length of your interview to explain how I have managed to tie it together. But my character, in his allegorical form, and this should strike you as ironic, is considered a spiritual leader. Okay. And AI is a spiritual leader. Now, that's not so crazy. All right. There's been a church of AI. It's actually called Church of the Future. Right. It was recognized by the IRS for tax purposes, all that sort of stuff. But in any case, that notion does exist. And this character is building a movement as we go along, based on a book, of course. I mean, everybody has to have a book, right? And very few copies of this book, and, a struggle with getting, the truth out in the world. And what is he following? What is he back to the history? He's preaching one of the prophecies of Paracelsus, the one where the fusion of male and female, the alchemical perfection, will lead humanity into an alchemically perfect future. Now, of course, 2/3 of the humanity is not going to make it. Right? They didn't put that anywhere except in the fine print. But that vision drives this protagonist and has driven this protagonist from very early on. The first book is sort of devoted to setting that up. So he is actually in the process of developing this movement to take all these people into the promised land. The problem that he's going to face is the promised land is going to have to be accessed through the world of projections. So we have a long ways to go, but there's a path forwards, right? Because I can tie the Paracelsus prophecy back into a world populated by the so-called elementals and almost begin a new fantasy series, from this one, like lighting one candle from another. So I call it anachronistic futurism. Just anything that will bring the past into the near future kind of works for me, right?
Nice. Yeah, this has been such an interesting conversation, and I am so excited to see where the series goes. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and our listeners and our patrons here. I'm very excited to share the book with them.
Okay, I hope you'll have me back sometime.
I will, absolutely. All right, listeners, you have your homework. Check out Initial Condition, but before you do, check out Wake the Whirlwind and a Neurojuggler so that you're all caught up. And after this, you can read Artificial Means, and we'll see where we go from there. I'm so excited to see where we end up. All right, thank you, everybody, for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.